Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday evening with us. I know we're an intimate crowd tonight, but I'm also using a microphone because we have people who will be joining us virtually online, so that's the only way they can hear us. But thank you for coming to the People's Forum. I don't know if you folks have been here before, but we are a political education center, a community center. Downstairs on your way, you passed another course on labor. We have movie screenings every week. We have a concert coming up next week, many things going on here. But that's just all to say that everything we do is in the service of working class movements here in the US and also internationally. And so that means we have to wear many hats. I'm very excited to welcome you here tonight for the book talk on Masterpiece, which examines the politics of expertise in the application of metropolitan theories of violence and practices of peacemaking in post-Civil War Lebanon. Through ethnographic encounters, archival research, and interviews that shed light on the worlds of academic research, UN agencies, NGOs, and think tanks, Nikolas Kosmatopoulos argues that so-called experts, from violence researchers to peace professionals, have often misrepresented and exacerbated the violence they claim to be tackling through their deployment of racialized tropes of conflict and communalizing peace practices. I really can't think of a more pertinent talk to be happening at this moment, because of course we're watching Israel continue to violate ceasefires in the region. They're continuing to violate South Lebanon. They're continuing to kill hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza. They refuse to let even a quarter of the 600 daily trucks of aid promised through the still closed Rafah crossing. And of course, we just watched right now as the UN approved this board of peace. And we know what peace looks like for imperialists. We know what peace in the region looks like to them. And so this book is really an important intervention in terms of actually defining what is peace and for whom. And I think this book really shows the different ways in which imperialism lays fertile ground for creating a stage for continued intervention, for continued dependence. But also as people who are invested in fighting for a better world, we know that this peace is a limiting definition. It's one that seeks to inhibit our imaginations for what kind of peace is possible. And we know that a just peace is possible, but only if we fight for it. So that's all to say. Very glad that you are all here for the discussion. I hope you raise a lot of questions, all of you here, and also to our virtual audience. And so I'll introduce our speakers for tonight. Tonight we'll be joined, of course, by the author, Nikolas Kosmatopoulos, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies and the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, Media Studies at the American University of Beirut. He is also the co-founder of the research collectives Floating Laboratory of Action and Theory at Sea, Decolonize Hellas, and his research and teaching fields of interest include political anthropology, policy expertise, and global institutions, in particular peacemaking, state building, and crisis resolution in the Middle East. His research has been published across different journals, including Peace Building, Social Anthropology, Third World Quarterly, Anthropology Today, and many others. And in conversation with him, we also have Yasmine Khayyat, who is a associate professor in the English department at the American University of Beirut. Her research and teaching interests include contemporary Arabic literature and poetry, cultural memory studies, and human-animal relationships in Arabic fiction. She was also here a couple of years ago to talk about her last book, War Remains, which was published by Syracuse University Press in 2023, and examines the figuration of the ruin as a site of resistance and potentiality in modern Lebanese novels, poetry, and sites of memory. Before we give them a warm welcome, I also want to add that we have two events coming up that also might be of interest to you. We're organizing an International Day of Solidarity with Palestine. It's one of the many marches that we've been organizing at the People's Forum as part of the Shut It Down Coalition. We have volunteer meetings here every single Monday where hundreds of people come across the city to organize in their neighborhoods. But that action will be happening at Columbus Circle at 1 p.m. on November 29th. And then also the Palestinian Youth Movement is putting forth a 4-part course on, again, how the U.S. continues to destabilize the region in a course called, I'm forgetting the name, America's Forever Wars in the Middle East. It's 4 sessions from December 2nd to 11th. Even if you can't be here in person, it'll also be online. We hope you can join us for all of these things and hope you give a warm welcome to our 2 speakers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess I should go first, right? Mic is going. And it's on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, do you want to start?
I
Nikolas is
should,
going
I
to
think.
present a little bit the book, and then I will open with some questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kate, so much for this introduction and for the invitation. It's always great to be at People's Forum. You guys do tremendous work, very important work, and I'm really honored to be part of the curriculum, let's say. This is indeed another way of another title that this talk would be America's Forever Peace, not Forever Wars, but it's also part of the same continuum somehow. So my idea was actually to talk among friends and colleagues here, but there are some others who came, and I'm also grateful. And looking forward to become also friends and colleagues, hopefully. The idea was to present the book a bit, some main contours of the book, so we can have something to talk about. And how I was thinking to do that was practically to tell you a bit more about today's Lebanon, where we are based. Today's Lebanon is a place where supposedly there is a ceasefire with Israel, between Israel and Hezbollah. In fact, the book came out 3 weeks after the ceasefire was announced. The ceasefire was announced November 2024. The book came out 17th of December 2024. And ever since, practically, we have peace, apparently. So it was, indeed a good timing for the book. At the same time, of course, as you most know, there's only ceasefire which affects one side. There's very much of a unilateral, monolateral ceasefire. Lebanon has ceased fire, and Israel continues practically to kill people every day in Lebanon, but also in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and so on. So one of the permanent fixtures of the landscape and of the soundscape in Lebanon is the drone. We live under the drone every day, also in Beirut, not only the south. I'm sure that you know that the south has been severely destroyed throughout the war. Entire villages have been obliterated. The entire infrastructure has been impacted. People have lost their lives, but also their belongings. And the chances actually to return, Israel doesn't allow people to return, doesn't allow any reconstruction. The government, unfortunately, is extremely weak and unwilling to go ahead with the reconstruction. And indeed, the drone somehow is a constant reminder of this situation. If you really try to forget, it's there to remind you that you're under practically a constant surveillance, a constant also possibility of a hit, of a sudden hit somewhere in the highway, somewhere in a refugee camp, or somewhere in a house that can immediately take out the person plus the families and neighbors, indiscriminate fire practically. So the idea of the drone, the presence of the drone was for me, a good reminder of how this distance, practically, the sense that the one who controls the drone is not really there, far away, miles far away, but still they can impose their will on the people underneath the drone. Kept me actually thinking about this, and the book practically became a different kind of book, under this experience. After the book was published, I start thinking about how to talk about a book that practically has become something else. It can happen that despite the fact that it's a finite product, it becomes something else after the place that the book talks about also changes, so the book changes with it. So one of the changes is indeed, this presence of the drone, and how the distant domination that the drone actually enables led me to reread the book and to rethink the book through this trope of the distant domination. So today I'm going to just present a different book. If you read the book, you're not going to find that trope at all. But it's just a way of making it a bit more exciting for you to indeed go ahead and read the book that I'm hoping that you do. So distant domination is a trope that I deploy here today to talk about at least 3 forms of expertise, 3 types of expertise that I analyze in the book. The first is the type of expertise that one could call academics, people who practically have studied and analyzed violence in the region, in Western Asia, in particular Lebanon. I look into the trope that one can actually call, or at least the field of studies that it's known as ethnic conflict. Those of you who don't know, ethnic conflict has been extremely popular trope to explain or explain away violences, types of violences in the Middle East or around the global South. Lebanon has been one of the celebrated laboratories of ethnic conflict. They tell us, so you have practically a series of academics, historians, political scientists in particular, who use this trope, particularly in the 90s, to explain, what's happening in the region. The idea was, of course, that the civil war, the Lebanese civil war, the war that happened since 1975 until 1990, was practically a typical case of ethnic conflict. Now, this came with, this trope came with different, in different versions. You can have some more addressing it as indeed ethnic conflict. Some others might actually call it sectarian conflict. I'm sure that you heard the word sectarianism in Lebanon. Many books deploy this trope to explain. Here go, Mazen already has a question in mind. Deploy this way of explaining what exactly is happening in the region, right? Sectarianism is a very, very popular trope. Again, deployed by academics, but also by journalists. In the book, I also follow how this trope became extremely popular in what we call, kind of mainstream journalism, So there are people like Benjamin Barber, for example, wrote a very famous article, eventually became a book, calling for, it was the article was very much depicting a kind of a black and white world. On one hand, you have the jihad, and on one hand, and the other hand, the Mac world, as they called it. It was the 90s, it was the idea of globalization, the peace was abandoned, it was time for peace. And of course, the ones who were against peace, against this new era, were very much, these people who were portrayed as fighting sectarian wars. So this kind of narration, the master narrative, as I call it, is very much based on this double move of racialization, I would call it. So on one hand, you portray the violence that happens on the ground as kind of, a form of racial violence. People fight each other on the basis of religion, as we keep listening, and we keep hearing about the region, They hate each other because of religion or because of sectarian readings of religion, if you wish, if you want to be a bit more eclectic. But still, this racialization practically applies on them, applies on the forms of violence. And at the same time, of course, it takes for granted that those who do the analysis are not affected by it. They can be rational, they can be practically out of this scheme, and they can portray different kinds of violence as racialized, and therefore they can enjoy this epistemic kind of distancing, like they are very far away, and they allow themselves to analyze, but at the same, of course, also judge how the people fight and how what are the reasons of fighting. What this kind of distancing, what ethnic conflict actually does, I argue in the book, of course, it silences other reasons, other structures, and other ideologies. First and foremost, the ideology of revolution. Many people in Lebanon, at least in the first phases of the war, fought in the name of revolution, of anti-colonial, even socialist revolution. Especially the left movement and the national movement. And to a great extent, I think that was part of their ideology, that was part of the motivation. And of course, what that, the trope of ethnic conflict does very much, takes out of the way or eclipses this kind of ideology. But it also does, actually, if you look at the discussion about violence and how violence became much more of a proper topic in social sciences, I don't want to go into epistemology now, but I'm sure that you can imagine that violence, it was not always treated as a topic. It was always treated as an anomaly, let's say, as a breakdown of the system. Anthropology, for example, became interested in violence very, very late, in the 80s and actually after the 80s, right? It was never a proper topic in its own right. So it's interesting, I think, to see this move, of the epistemic move of talking about the ethnicization of violence, the minute that that violence became extremely central as an epistemic field. So eventually, practically, it served as a form of, if you wish, like epistemic counter-revolution, the way that practically violence was discussed much more centrally by social movements, but also by social scientists. This movement, this counter-movement, this intellectual counter-revolution, if you wish, of portraying violence, especially in the global south, as sectarian, as ethnic, as pre-modern practically, because this is the implication, this is the idea behind it. I do believe that served also as an epistemic counter-move to discussing violence as a form, as a structure very much related to, to structural, ideological, and other forms of liberation and even emancipation. So these are the people that I'm looking at, and this is actually how Lebanon, to a great extent, became one victim. Our understanding of Lebanon became one victim of that. Of course, you can imagine that this kind of narrative then moved on to Yugoslavia. The next victim, the epistemic victim of this kind of discussion, the term Balkanization is very well known. I'm sure you're not, you're aware of that, but before that, I'm sure you've heard also the term Lebanonization. So there was Lebanonization meant the same thing, meant practically the situation where people fight each other on the basis of ancient hatreds, of ancient sectarian, predispositions. And after that, of course, this trope traveled in different parts of the world. In fact, to an extent, it was even applied on Palestine. There were some people who tried to apply the ethnic trope on Palestine and describe what's happening as an ethnic conflict between, two different nations. And you can imagine here we are in the space that this discussion has been had to a great extent. So you can imagine also the implications of this application on Palestine, and how much other forms, how the roots of the conflict practically have been silenced. It's not really an intranational conflict. It's not a conflict between two nations. It's practically settler colonial violence. And that, of course, has to do with the words we choose. Conflict as a word is already problematic. And that brings me to the second field, which is the field of conflict resolution. One of the important elements of of deployment of peacemaking in Lebanon, but also in Palestine, but also in other places around the world, and then again in places that didn't even have conflict necessarily. That's also the interesting part, was the industry of conflict resolution. Conflict resolution was, again, an industry that, and I call it industry because of course it had to do with money, it had to do also with careers, had to do also with curricula. It was practically a full-blown academic field. By now you can also study conflict resolution, you can get a degree in conflict resolution. There are departments of conflict resolution. It's not really a fringe, it's a very much the center. And many of good people practically go to study conflict resolution. There's nothing negative about it. But what I was actually interested in, it's looking at the content, what really happens when one studies conflict resolution. Lebanon, back in the day when I did my research, that was actually some years ago, Lebanon was one of the laboratories of civil society, NGOs, conflict resolution NGOs. That was also the outpour of Palestine. Palestine, of course, if anything, is the main place where this field bloomed and blossomed. But Lebanon was not at all second. In fact, one can say that Lebanon was extremely privileged to have civil society organizations that they were funded and promoted by European and American NGOs and conflict resolution organizations. So I follow in the book actually how this industry landed in Lebanon. And what I argue is that practically what it did, it co-opted the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement was a phenomenon of the late Civil War. So in the late 1985, mid-1980s to 1990s, you had practically the formation of what we call the anti-war movement in Lebanon. It was, to a great extent, also a movement quasi-labor, including labor organizers, but also, of course, the mothers of the disappeared, reflecting what happened also in Argentina. They also got a lot of ideas from Argentina and the mothers of Cinco de Mayo, the famous mothers of the Argentinian and disappeared. And this movement practically back in the day, of course, had a series of demands, and in the demands included the end of the war, first and foremost, but also the persecution of those who are responsible for the war. And that was, to a great extent, a political demand. There was also a political movement to a great extent. They had a reading of the war that was extremely also connected, that was organically connected with structural, ideological, social, and political issues. And these people practically eventually lost, if you wish. Lebanon, post-war Lebanon, as you may know, was a place where the reconstruction happened in terms of an agenda of gentrification, practically, of a neoliberal gentrification agenda. Downtown Lebanon was extremely also central in this gentrification until today. And this gentrification, I think, it's a good metaphor to talk about how a civil society itself, from a vanguard, a political vanguard, somebody who could actually pursue some political demands and political aims, became the object of intervention by these experts. So I trace an inversion of power here, in which found the end of it, found political society in Lebanon, civil society in Lebanon, practically characterized as an uncivil society, potentially uncivil society that needs to be civilized, trained, disciplined, put into forms of professional but also moral grammars that would secure that no return to the civil war will happen again. So the function of these experts practically depoliticize the society, define violence as quasi as an epidemiological phenomenon to which one should isolated, as in a Latourian sense, how Latour describes the epidemiologists, the microbiologists, how they work. They need to be somehow isolated into secure spaces of workshop resolution, conflict resolution workshops, and then dealt with. At the same time, of course, many of the civil society members were promoted or were pushed, or at least expected to become themselves professionals of conflict resolution, and that also gave rise to what I call the industry. There were many material reasons for this field to take root in Lebanon. One particular reason and very banal, but also very important for many people, is, for example, the ability to travel, mobility. Because what one could do when one joins the field was practically the ability to travel through visas that are provided for members of international NGOs, whereas if you're not a member of the NGO, if you were just a member of the anti-war movement before, and you wanted, for example, to travel from Lebanon to Egypt, which is a fellow Arab country, you could not. But now that you could join, through the NGO, you could practically join. And I think this is also an important element that needs to come to consideration if you want to understand how NGOs are so successful in places like Lebanon, because they include not only professional quasi security, financial security, but also mobility inside of immobility that actually is imposed by visas and other forms of constraint. So that field played, I think, a very important role in co-opting civil society into what one today would call, the conflict resolution classes. I mean, at AUB, my university, we teach conflict resolution. And it's interesting because one of the field somehow borrows from the other. So many of the conflict resolution curricula include the definition of Lebanon as an ethnic conflict. So hence there is a connection between them. Hence there is also a regime. That's why I talk about a regime that connects practically and brings together seemingly different fields, from the academics to the civil society practitioners and that's the last field that I want to talk about, to the so-called think tankers, which is, I think, a very interesting phenomenon. And as an anthropologist, I can say that not many anthropologists have been studying think tanks, and there is also a debate about whether think tanks are important or not. What is the role of think tanks today? But I can say that Lebanon, because of its connection also to imperial centers, had many institutions, could host many institutions that are doing this kind of work, the think tank work, which is practically an analysis of crisis. I looked particularly in crisis think tanks, and how they work. Where did they get their legitimacy, and how do they do their job practically? The crisis think tank is a phenomenon, I argue, of the 90s, very much so. Crisis as a word became extremely popularized in the 90s in that particular setup, that particular reading of crisis in the political event. More and more events in politics were characterized as crisis, and I mean now crisis that came also with a moral imperative to intervene. And that practically is the new element. The element is that the crisis should be is an invitation for intervention, which again, comes much more forcefully in the 90s and becomes a grammar, a widespread grammar in the world. Many of the events were characterized as crises that need to be tackled before they get bigger. The lessons, of course, were supposed to be learned from the Rwanda genocide. In particular, the crisis think tank that I look at, grounded its moral legitimacy in the Rwanda genocide. The whole idea was that we didn't really make it in Rwanda. We were too late. We let a crisis develop into a genocide. So next time we should be faster. We should act immediately. We should develop the structures of early warning mechanisms. Okay, this is where crisis is joined with early warning intervention attack, to make sure that we get the sentinel. In the military, you have this frontier soldier of the frontier component that sends signals, of enemy mobilization. This is the form of the sentinel. So in the book, I describe these think tanks as sentinels. I take the military metaphor seriously. And I do believe because that eventually they do this kind of military work, and themselves at some point they admit it, some of the think tankers themselves, they take credit for doing great intelligence work. And I think this is very important to place them in this category, in this the function, to show how they function as sentinels practically in a kind of a global counterinsurgency campaign that the West especially unleashed after 9/11. We should also place think tanks, even if themselves believe that they belong to what we call, the kind of a liberal democratic spectrum. They are not really the hawkish, so to say, intelligence services. So and this is also another form of distance. Again, now I dropped the trope, but I want to return now back and show how exactly this form of distance works. This is a form of distance that promises kind of a panoptical view of the situation, where identifies certain suspect entities. And of course, in that case, we talk in the Middle East, you can imagine who the suspect entities are. Most of the production of these think tanks is on these suspect entities, okay? That they call themselves resistance, for example. Of course, a lot of that is on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Many of the think tanks produce work on Hezbollah in Lebanon, or on Hamas, or on other similar actors in the Lebanese context or the Palestinian context. So this is, I think, not only about what kind of information they produce, but also an epistemological field in which you have a series of experts who are trained, who learn to look at these movements from the point of view of counterinsurgent panoptical logic. And I think it's important that it produces also a way of it's not just a narrative, but also a kind of a perspective. And this perspective has effects, has implications, has consequences. I argue also in the book. So panoptical distance is one. The disciplinary distance is the second, is the distance of the civil society, in which, conflict resolution becomes a discipline in the Foucauldian sense, not only in the in the sense of curricula. It is a discipline, certainly taught in the universities, but also becomes a discipline which disciplines, the way that we even mourn violence. And it's very interesting that tropes like guilt are introduced in the curriculum, and how people are taught to mourn, or to spend their time talking about reflecting on the war through this imported, and I'm talking imported now also from other contexts. For example, to an extent, some of the trainers were from South Africa. And the idea was that South Africa was and similar issue, whereas not necessarily, of course, the colonial similarity was not introduced. What was introduced was that there was another kind of conflict that brought a civil war. So in the book, I also identify this form of distance, the disciplinary distance, and the first, as I talked already, is the epistemic distance that entails elements of racialization, how violence is practically portrayed as racialized and therefore different from our kind of violence. So I think this distance is extremely important, and it's around. It is here today. To a great extent, is of course what the Israelis are talking about. How the Palestinian violence is different than the Israeli violence, right? It's a violence that is identified also with animals, with subhumans, with other even categories of humanity, whereas their violence it's more, it's actually a modern, liberal, and irrational violence, and sometimes also apparently, chirurgical, as they say. So this is more or less the argument of the book. I left some parts out, of course, so for your well-being. I didn't really include the other parts, but you get the idea. today, there is a section in the last page where I try to think about what is a counter example or a solution or another way of dealing with this. Going back to Palestine, I take very much inspiration from the way that the Palestinians portray and depict their own struggle. And I find also interesting that there is a concept, there is a word in the Palestinian Arab circles that describes these forms of resistance called zero distance. And I think this is a very interesting concept that
Zero distance.
zero distance, masafar safar, exactly. And of course, initially it's portrayed in the military terms, and the masafar safar means actually that it means to portray the heroic Palestinian fighters who reduce the distance in the military field, and they just go and drop a piece of military equipment in the Merkava, by just eliminating any form of distance between the two. And by that, I think it's the most accurate and acute definition of eliminating the distance. But of course, it became metaphorical too. People in Egypt use it as a way of identifying with the Palestinians, saying that for us, despite the fact that we are far away, we don't feel that we are far away. There's zero distance between us. We feel like we are Palestinians. We're all Palestinians, especially when it comes from this sense, when it comes from the Arab neighbors of Palestine, because I'm sure that they would like many of them to indeed reduce the distance and participate, in the liberation of Palestine. So it's interesting, I think, that Palestine is also the laboratory of masterpiece. It is very much so the place where all of these forms that I described were developed during the 90s around the Oslo. Okay, we know about the Oslo, but what I try to do is to show you how Oslo was practically the culmination, the apotheosis of many different forms of warlike peace. And despite the fact that, in fact, exactly as Palestine was the main laboratory of these forms of masterpiece, it might also become the laboratory of the destruction of masterpiece. And this is what I think we are facing now, we are living through now. In one way, the book is the obituary of masterpiece, because practically the Palestinian resistance and what happens also in the Middle East now, and what happens actually in the whole world, and what happens also here, or one can also say with pretty much securely that we live the time of open war. The time of liberal peace is officially dead. Right? I think not even peacemakers anymore use these forms of intervention. Now peace is something that Trump delivers by decree, for example. Doesn't even have to soothe the cure or justify the delivery. It's very much kind of a hard politics, or back to the Schmittian definition, if you wish, of politics. So one can actually describe the book indeed as an obituary of a 30-year-long ideological field. I call it techno-moral because it has also technical and moral ideological underpinnings of masterpiece. And we might safely perhaps say that this is something that could explain how the war has been fought on different levels. The continuation of the Lebanese civil war is something that the Lebanese, of course, refer to very often, that the war never really ended. What I try to do in this book is to suggest another way that the war continued and became indeed a war that didn't allow many otherwise hopeful opportunities for the Lebanese to take a different route, to explore this route. They were practically pushed into a corner, and they had to somehow, succumb, let's say, to this masterpiece. I think I'm going to stop here. You got the idea, hopefully, and then maybe we can actually discuss with questions or even critiques, interventions. Yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'll ask a few questions, and then everyone else can as well. So what intrigues me about your book is that it pushes us to think, to confront the dark side of peace, expertise. And as a scholar of war literature, I find that our subject matters converge much more than they part ways. Your work shows how peace is another arena of war, and that international experts, NGOs, and institutions shape not only the politics of post-conflict, but the very ways people are allowed to speak about violence and the ways they're silenced if they don't abide by the lexicon of this prescribed peace. Can you tell us more about this NGOization of peace and how it speaks to the present apocalyptic moment in Lebanon, wherein war rages on behind this violent veneer of peace, so-called?
All right. I know you don't believe me, but I didn't know the question. I didn't know about this.
Even if you did.
Even if I did, yes. Yeah, okay. The NGOization of peace. I think it's part of a broader critique that scholars and other analysts, but also movement organizers, have been waging. About the problem with NGOs. And what exactly it brings. There are standard critiques, the lack of accountability, the way that NGOs portray the society as in need of cure, of care, or even of the way that practically it. I mean, my rather, let me put it otherwise. I think the main issue that this particular critique on NGO tackles is that it practically shrinks the horizon of possibility and the horizon of liberation. It turns the society from an actor to an object of intervention. That's why I play with words and I call it an uncivil society. It depicts a society as an object that needs to be intervened upon through civilizing missions. That, of course, this is an old colonial trope, to civilize the society, to civilize the subalterns. But this time, of course, we don't call it that. We call it conflict resolution. And the implication here is that, these people, if they are taught, if they learn how to deal with their anger, if they are taught how to deal with their conflict, with the grievances, we will have less violence. So I can imagine how problematic that is, first of all, by declaring violence, an inherently bad thing, and I mean, or the grievance, if you wish. The grievance is actually something that leads to violence. There's a form of depoliticizing violence, of trying to, to take it out of the society, despite the fact that many of the societies we're talking about are permitted by violence that, to a great extent, also comes from outside, like in Palestine or Lebanon or, of course, Iraq and many other, Syria, and many other places in the region we're talking about. So that's one of the main issues, depoliticization of violence. But I think the shrinking of the horizon of, how people are being, I watched also how many of the young minds, the brilliant minds of Lebanese, they are taught to, that the future for the country and for themselves is through these channels. And they are taught practically to think or to act within certain set frameworks. that are based on the idea that their society needs to be re-educated. And I think this is a very much different project than the political education, what you guys are doing here. It's practically it's a re-education. It's a form of extracting from this society some of the most interesting and the most actually hopeful ideas about political liberation, progress, even emancipation. So this is a different kind of NGOization. It's not just about, of course, how NGOs, compartmentalize or cut down, reduce big structures into mono issues. This is a standard critique of NGOs, but I think this is important here to show how even the idea of political political emancipation has been practically shut down or being, co-opted to mean something else. Which brings me to the wider point that we don't really. I think that we really need to talk about how exactly the ideological warfare works in the region, and I think this is very important to understand that this war practically targets the brains, the minds, and there are so many different ways of doing that. The Palestinians, for example, nowadays, of course, they suffer in the most acute sense because the Israeli army targets their brains, and sometimes also literally. They target the academics, target also, they kill the engineers, they kill the poets, they kill all the people that can practically raise the consciousness, raise also the memory, keep the memory, educate the new generation, bring back the society to its feet, And I think there is a conscious campaign of eradicating minds. Then you have the other part of eradicating minds through migration and through destroying countries. Syria is a case in point. I think, most of the Syrian migration to Germany, Safi is here, he can tell us more, is they did about brilliant minds that they were educated by the Syrian state, and now they work in Germany. Germany never paid anything to educate these people. So it is practically a net way of profit, practically for Germany. At the same time, of course, Syria lost a whole generation, if not 2 generations of educated people, and needs to be redone. And the brains that actually are not get assassinated or don't get to migrate, practically they get to, co-opted to forms of, looking at their own society in ways that can be portraying their own society practically as an uncivil society. And I think this is also a very, very constant issue in the Arab world. For example, how gender has been taught in the Arab world, I think it's very open to discussion, also in my own university. It's extremely one-sided, the implication is that this society has a gender issue, for example. Or the society has a sectarian issue, has a sectarian problem, And I think these are extremely problematic assumptions that also force another, in this sense, NGOization means much more than just a professional, compartmentalization. It's actually it's part of the ideological warfare of reducing, how the societies believe in themselves, And I can go on and on, how, for example, Lebanese are never taught their own history, how we also in the university that I teach, how we teach the political history of the world, where Arabs are not necessarily present, Arab thinkers, for example. But these are issues that have been discussed by others much better, and how education needs also to be decolonized. I don't know if it makes sense.
So your work sits at an unusual and energetic crossroads: anthropology, international relations, and political science. How did working across these disciplines shape your methodology in the book and otherwise? And what challenges did you face as an anthropologist studying spaces usually reserved for policy experts, political scientists, and all those people you critique?
Yeah, thanks. Well, the first challenge was to find a reviewer for the book because nobody really felt that they could, they could address all the different aspects. So one reviewer said, "This is not anthropology. I cannot
Yeah.
really review it." Another said, "This is not politics. I cannot review it." So this is a problem also when you try to tip and to wear too many hats. Then you fall into the disciplinary silos and you get somehow lost in them. So I think that's the main issue because the approach, as you said, the methodology was included, of course, fieldwork, kind of international fieldwork because I did fieldwork also in New York among think tanks, also in Geneva among UN people, and in Beirut among the people that we talked about, NGOs and others. But it's not your typical anthropological fieldwork in that sense. So I did. This is also why, for example, anthropologists never really hired me in Beirut. I was hired by the political studies department. I don't know. Maybe it's personal. Maybe it's. I don't really know what it is, but definitely there is something there. So this was definitely a challenge that I faced, and also then how you write a book that is one chapter is ethnography, the other chapter is really about practically intellectual history in a way when it comes to how the tropes, the intellectual tropes or the epistemic tropes were used and abused. So these were the main challenges when it comes to setting up, structuring the book and delivering the argument. Also where people could sometimes follow, sometimes actually could not see the methodology as a coherent methodology, but I think this is the way to do it. I do stick to my guns, let's say, methodological guns, of course, which because the more I could follow the field, the more I realized that you need to go back to the archive. You need actually to somehow do a genealogy of the ethnic conflict and how it's been used or abused. So you needed somehow to go beyond your typical anthropological fieldwork, because I could not really find answers only through the fieldwork. I needed actually to do some more extra research in some other parts, and also bring in some other conversations that were also very important from other fields. So practically, it's the research question that led me to this kind of methodology. It was not really my initial will or plan to do that. It was mostly in order to understand how the field has been created. I started following the creation of the field, follow the field practically, and that necessarily introduce some other methodologies along the way. I think so. That would be another way to describe what happened.
I have some more questions, but should we maybe open it up to the audience and then I can ask mine so that I'm not monopolizing only the time? The floor is temporarily open.
Temporarily. It'll close
If
again.
not, I'll ask a question.
Test it. Oh,
Go ahead. Hi.
test. It's quite loud, so maybe actually you can just repeat the question if we go.
Sure.
That makes sense. Cool. Thank you.
Or
Thank you for this presentation. My name is Noor, I'm from Lebanon. And can you talk a bit more about this idea of zero distance and what you mean by it and what you produce out of it in regards to Lebanon?
in regards to Lebanon? Oh. Well, zero distance was mostly a trope, again, that was produced during the surface during the genocide and the resistance against it in Gaza. So it's very much located and rooted in the Palestinian struggle. Now, how this can be transplanted into the Lebanese context, I think I haven't really thought about it. But if you ask me to think about it, of course, a way of reading the book is to deny, let's say, the distance that the experts produce in order to govern their subjects, because the main argument of the book is that this regime of control, of domination over questions of war and peace in Lebanon, and also of subjects of war and peace, necessitates different forms of distance, right? So eliminating the distance, eliminating the epistemic distance that's built on forms of racialization, racialized theories of violence, for example, is a way forward. It's a zero distance application where zero distance can be applied on epistemology, where we don't really accept or we don't really promote theories of racialized, kind of conflict, even the ethnic conflict theory. I think it should be somehow retired. I think it's extremely problematic, has done a lot of damage, epistemological damage, and I also argue it has also done political work. It's part of the counter-revolutionary epistemic, the epistemic counter-revolution, rather. So that's another way of applying this. In the sense of the NGOs, for example, I think it's important to embrace the Lebanese history of struggles and of solidarities, and not depend on a field that, to a great extent, produce itself through these forms of distance. The distance of experts between themselves and the society. We need to actually go back to politics, go back to political organization, political education. I think this is another form of eliminating this kind of hierarchies that they were produced through the role of NGOs, and I think it's extremely important. Flatten, if you wish, the hierarchies and flatten this the pyramidal way of organization that comes with NGOs. The unaccountability that comes with it, the forms of apolitical reading of the society, but also, as I said, it's a very important element of their work is to keep reproducing an image of the society that needs to be, cured and intervened upon. Okay, and this is, I think, also the dynamics, of course, of donors. How the donor should be convinced that you need the money to do this kind of intervention. So you have to depict a society that is ailing, it's in need of different forms of intervention that you are able to provide. So zero distance would mean also that, the elimination of this kind of apolitical field, the buffer zone between the society and the expert that's supposed to be dealing with it. And of course, in the last part, zero distance would mean also to repoliticize, not to repoliticize, sorry, to re-admit actors that have been deemed terrorists, or other forms of, they have been deemed actually, they have been expelled from the realm of politics, for the liberal, apparently, camp. The word and the trope, the industry of terrorism, of course, was extremely important to do this kind of work, to expel these actors from the political field outside of the field, and to demonize them and so on. We have to reintegrate these actors and to retire words like terrorist, especially when they're used in a way to depoliticize extremely important political issues. So this would be, I think, my ways to zero the distance when it comes to the phenomenon I tackle in the book. I think so.
I'm thinking, thank you so much.
Welcome.
I'm thinking out loud. I haven't thought about this more than 30 seconds. But I feel like today, there was a poll today in, I don't know which journal, that stated that 80% of Lebanese people are against Israel. And a lot of people that were not Shia supported Hezbollah during the past war. And so I think that within Lebanese society, there is very much more of the zeroing of the distance. And I'm just wondering, how do we take this into account? And how do we deal with this in regards to, of course, Tom Barak and whoever coming to Lebanon and saying we're animals and whatever. And within ourselves, there is something that is changing. And and of course the conversation with outside is different, but how can we, or I guess it's not how, but I'm just thinking about this. What can we do with this? Because I think that we're already somewhere that is moving, and there's already action, and I can definitely tell that my generation, which is like 20s, 30s, is on another level than our parents and anyone that is older, and there's a literacy in terms of politics and political education that is different, especially for people who leave Lebanon and then come back. So I just want to acknowledge this out loud and think about this.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm very happy to hear that. And I believe you. I think I can see it also in my students, what you just suggested, and the poll. We do poll every week with our students. We poll the desires and the opinions, and I do believe that if there is something hopeful coming out of this genocide, is the zeroing of distance, or what you suggested, and I do believe that we see it everywhere. That we see practically the buffer zone that was out there, the cloud, the ideological clouding, that was very much produced through the ideological warfare that I tried to describe, is thinning out. I do believe that too. So if you wish, the only thing that one can practically take as a lesson from this book is to make sure that these movements are not co-opted, not to fall in the same traps again. Because counterinsurgency can come in different forms and shapes. It can be also an ideological counterinsurgency that embraces at some point your aims and then turns them into something else. So there's much needed for being ideologically alert, and I think this is a way forward. Zeroing the distance is something that, as you said, that the resistance practically in Palestine made possible. So I think this is important to give that credit where credit is due, and the resistance also in other parts, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in other parts of the Arab world, but also beyond that, but mainly there. But I think there are many other steps that need to be taken in order for this zeroing to really bear some hopeful results. I'm not the one to say what, but from the point of view of the authorship of the book only, I'm saying, the cooptation of these aims, for these desires of these movements is perhaps the most acute danger that we can see, especially when it comes to how movements have been co-opted, in the West, but also in the Arab world, So, sure, I think this is a very hopeful prediction. I hope you're right.
I don't know, I'm just thinking.
Inshallah, yeah. Why not? I think it's good to believe that this is correct. Wow, this has a lot of questions. Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation, and congratulations on publishing your book, and congratulations on surviving Yasmine's tough questions. I have a couple of points to raise and see where they take us. You said
Should I take notes? Should I take notes?
Yeah, get your pen out.
I'm sure you've thought about these things many times. You said that your book is an obituary of masterpiece,
Could be.
which gives me a kind of a hope that there might be more possibilities to explore different avenues and trajectories towards genuine peace. Because the context that I'm more familiar with is NGOs and development, where they end up perpetuating the conditions of their own existence.
Yeah.
And the actors that you're talking about, the experts, so to speak, must find a way for them to exist.
Yeah.
And it's never to solve the problem that created the reason for their existence in the first place. They end up doing the work that governments should be doing.
Yeah.
The NGO sector notoriously picks up the pieces, so to speak, of all not only the work that governments don't do, but even the negative effects of what governments do, and therefore just prolong the very thing that they are supposed to eliminate. So there, I feel like it's a kind of a ring of hopeful hope in the practical sense, not hope in the optimistic sense. That there might something might come out of the demise of the industry, as you called it, and it is an industry. It's more like maybe a business because it doesn't produce anything. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. The second point is you did not mention at all the multidimensional antagonism that structured Lebanese society in all of this discourse. Historically, of different factions that have different visions of the country, the nature of the country, the nature of the state, the relationship of the country to the so-called Arab world, the relationship of the country to the so-called West, and we should always problematize these terms because the West takes itself for granted as the West. I'm not sure this entity exists, the so-called West. So you have all these different factions that are deeply entrenched in a political economic system that is also based on historically entrenched clientelism. So when you talk about political education, the cynical in me is left with this, like, this is not going to go very far. Political education, I mean, there are very, really, like, sincerely well-meaning people that are working towards a different future, towards a different present even. You know, the generation you're talking about gives you so much hope, but there's only so much they can do. Because eventually they either are co-opted because they have to live, and if you want to live in Lebanon, you have to know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows the right person, or they leave, like some of us, because there's no future for them in the country in which you either have to be born with affluence or you just have to accept it. So, you know, when you talk about peace in this sense, and you have different factions who have different ideas of what peace for this country means, what possibilities are there in terms of negotiating an actual peace without the peace of the junta? You know, because you can arrive at a peace in which the different factions agree between them to divide the
spoils,
the measly resources of the country, and you know, everybody lives in destitution. There's a sort of there was at least a sort of this peace until the recent conflagrations. So how do you square the antagonism between these different factions and a narrative of peace that actually applies to the state or the country as a country?
All right, there were many points indeed. I mean, I'll try to be as humble as possible. First of all, you know, I'm not really even suggesting to suggest actually a solution. I'm not even suggesting a solution in the book in terms of what the Lebanese should do. But in terms of the first question, I do believe that, of course, these experts that you talk about have an instinct of survival, a survival instinct that allows them, of course, to redress themselves or to transform into something else. You know, the same way, for example, you know, a very good example is how the Soviet experts, you know, in the US establishment, you know, that was a huge thing back in the day. You know, the experts on the Soviet affairs. You have to learn, of course, Russian and so on, and that was a business, that was a career, you know, Russian expert, Soviet expert, and then suddenly everything collapses, and then, you know, you might have to become unemployed. But then, of course, they re-engineered another threat, which was, of course, Islam. So overnight, these people became Islam experts, you know, or at least they got into talking about Islam in similar ways that they talk about Soviet Union. So that's why we see also continuity, you know. So what I'm saying, of course, the continuity of survival, dictated by survival. You might also have a different forms of continuity in these peacemakers. They can become something else. Of course, and this time they can even become, of course, war makers. I think, you know, that's also an interesting development that you can see in Europe. Europe now officially has entered a war phase, and I mean by that major European leaders practically call for the militarization of the industry, So that might also have an impact on the soft power. You know, if Europe goes to war, let's say if its industries are supposed to be transformed into military industries, for example, Germany is very much supporting this idea. You might practically have now peacemakers indeed get into the guise of the war maker, whatever that means. You know, you might actually have people who understand that the winds have changed, shifted, and they might have to follow the new trend. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see people who might join, for example, naturalism, militarism, you know, even those who until recently were on that path. But it would be interesting also, for example, the question is what's going to happen with the UN? You know, what is the future of the UN? I'm not really very much invested in this discussion myself. I don't really do this discussion but it's a discussion that's been happening at the UN, especially when the UN now has been very much, defunded, and it's an interesting, I think, conversation that I cannot really predict. But I won't be surprised if they join, much more. It's a join, for example, the new trend, which is very much about war making. So that's more or less, I think, my answer to your first question. The second question about the clientelist system and the political education and so on, it's very important. And I think it's very also difficult to answer. I don't have an answer, but I do have a chapter which looks at how Lebanese leaders create another form of distance from the busy, otherwise, considered as not busy, as kind of politically turbulent and tumultuous, Beirut, and they go to Switzerland to figure out, their affairs. I look at the history of Lebanese national dialogues, where the elites go to Switzerland or to other places of opulence, like the Qatar, like in Doha, Qatar, as in the latest agreements or others, and the implication that they need a geographical distance from the country in order to figure out a solution among themselves. So I do describe that kind of tradition, albeit it's not really a new tradition, it's not really a post-Cold War tradition, it goes even further back. So you do have, of course, this tendency, as you say, this structure of clientelism, but I don't necessarily hope that this will be, the education I'm talking about is not really something that will come from these actors. I'm talking about at some point, basic need of teaching, the history of Lebanon and the region. You don't really do that in the schools in Lebanon. The Lebanese students that I teach at AUB and that we teach at AUB, sometimes they fail to identify major events in the Lebanese history, and I'm not really talking now about, a national history. I'm talking about, for example, a history of the region from the point of view, for example, of its integration to colonial, structures, including colonial education. So I think that would be important, for example, to have a People's Forum in Beirut, an institution of political education where it does this kind of work. It's extremely important. You don't have that. You don't really, unfortunately, what you have is donor-based institutions that are, of course, to a great extent, institutions that are, telling a story of how Lebanon needs to be reformed. They repeat ad nauseum, the claim of clientelism, which is true, but I think it tells the half of the story. It's not really enough. I think we should talk about how Lebanon's even sectarianism was very much related to colonial political economies and colonial integration, and communalization of the minorities, of how minorities became minorities in this part of the world, and this is where Zionism, for example, is very important, even Hellenism, if you ask, but I don't want to open that kind of worms, but maybe another time. Yeah, but I do believe this kind of political education is needed. And I'm interested in practically myself, also for the region in general, not only Lebanon but also in Greece, okay, where I was born, and I'm more aware of how the political, how the educational system depoliticized practically, extremely important aspects of the society. So that would be perhaps a way to deal with, where the social movements indeed take responsibility for educating the society and not necessarily outsourcing this education elsewhere. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I also find it fascinating to think about how narrative sense making ultimately like goes back and changes conditions that were being studied or written on. And my question is a follow-up to that, because I think that that speaks to the richness of your work. I'm wondering if you found thematically, if you found a diagnosis between those different categories, because you talk about the category of like the NGOs, the civil society, the think tankers. Where was it that there was consolidation between all of those different categories on what the diagnosis of violence or peace is? And then if there were tensions or fissures between them and within them, did you find anything like surprising in like where they were diverging and where they were consolidating?
All right. Good question. I don't think I have an answer exactly. I mean, I did have an eye, I think, for conflict within the conflict field, and where there was divergences, divisions, and even different approaches. I tried to portray them in the book to be a bit more. I really like the question because it is about, of course, not portraying them as kind of, cement-like. There's much more diversity. There's much more heterogeneity in the field itself. So there was a lot of division and fitna, and problems within the conflict resolution field. There were disagreements about how to move forward. That's why, of course, it never took off practically in Lebanon, because there was also a lot of suspicion in the civil society on the peace word. As Lebanese were historically suspicious of peacemakers, and for good reason. Because for many it meant normalization, tarbiyah, and we don't really want to do that. So there was a lot of pushback against that. So that was part of the problem. The other problems were, for example, where in the think tankers, sometimes the subjects under suspicion, the subjects under surveillance, they would also push back. There was a lot of negotiation there. There was a lot of give and take, but also sometimes absolute breakup of the whole relationship of surveillance, because it also takes two, not only to tango but also to survey. It's also very much about how the actors in hand, they were agreed to be surveyed and to be under surveillance. So I think that was also part of conflict, where you could see that there were disagreements, fissures, what you say, and so on. Now, sometimes there were overlaps between academics who also wore the NGO hat, and they tried also to open, to start the conflict resolution field. So you had, of course, indeed professional clashes. The activists saw the academics with suspicion, especially academics that they were importing the field from the US, importing some of the ideas from the US. There was a lot of suspicion. There was a lot of mistrust. So yeah, I have parts of the book that talk about all of this, divisions and disagreements, and how they indeed played their role in setting up the stage, at least in Lebanon. Yeah, I think this is the main analysis. Now, if you ask me if I saw something that surprised me or I didn't expect, was definitely the parts where I could see how the revolving doors. It's a concept that we use usually for establishment experts. How they move from politics to academia to think tanks, sometimes to military positions, especially when it comes to Israel. You have people who do this kind of thing, but that could also be applied. I didn't know that. I didn't expect that this concept of revolving doors could be applied in the field that I'm talking about. You know, how think tanks, NGOs, mediation, diplomats, and academics can also play this the musical chairs game. You know, yeah, that would be perhaps my my idea. But I never thought about this. Thanks.
Yes.
You had a question.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was very good listening.
Thank you.
To your work. I have two questions.
All right.
The first, you mentioned, which is something I liked. One of the points I liked is that you were referencing the 90s as the time interval where a lot was happening.
Yeah.
And speaking of peace, also, like it was the time when Shimon Peres wrote the New
course.
Middle East, which 30 years later Netanyahu also is talking about a new Middle East. So about peace, and specifically in Lebanon at the beginning of the 90s, the civil war was ending. And you mentioned the civil or uncivil society or NGOs hijacking the anti-war movement. I'd like if you elaborate on that, because I'm not aware of what could be called as anti-war movement.
Yeah.
I'm aware of, like in 2019, 20, there were mothers demonstrating in Shayyah and Ghammani. So I know about that. I don't know about the original version of this.
Yeah.
That's my first question. Like how did the 90s and like all the things that were happening in the 90s propagate through the Lebanese politics, ideologies? Because also you mentioned ideology.
Yeah.
The second is, I know like the book seems like some sort of a meta study of, so like you're studying how, I think it requires that you have an implicit position or counter argument, like for you to critique these experts, and so then you have your implicitly or explicitly your reading, your analysis. If it's not ethno-conflict, what is it? Not asking you now to tell me what is it,
Yeah.
because I always have this dissonance in my head that, and I don't share some opinions on the NGOs, because I think NGOs are like religion. You can't eliminate religion. You can eliminate the conditions that lead to religion. So, but the narrative, the diagnosis seems, like very easy for people to stick to adopt. And you mentioned this; it was popularized and so. So yeah, I always think about that in regarding the alternative analysis that seems to be not capturing, like some people talk about class politics, for example, regarding the civil war, but then it looks fragile and dwarfed by the NGOing narrative. So I'd also like to hear about that.
Thank you. Yeah, very good questions. But the 90s, yeah, it's interesting because many would agree with you whether one could call it even what was happening anti-war movement. Maybe it's a bit of a overblown self label. So what I found out again in my research during my research was that there were instances and organizations, many of them also inspired by anti-militarization movements elsewhere. So, for example, there were some activists who were inspired by the anti-military movement in France, and they wanted to apply and deploy similar tactics and techniques in Lebanon to stop the war, especially when the war has become, in the end, it became practically extremely deadly and practically a war of warlords. So many organized different meetings and different sort of demonstrations. So there was this famous demonstration that was supposed to unite the country that started from Trablus all the way to Sur, and people wanted to walk through and break practically through to break the checkpoints, the militia checkpoints. The mother was also an important thing. There were also labor strikes against the war that didn't really take off in the workers' movement. It didn't become part of the Confederation of Labor, but they were somehow part of the labor history of Lebanon, here and there. And there were some practically small organizations that also promoted reconciliation, after the war. And this organization promoted reconciliation organically, from below. So I interviewed and I followed some of these activists, and they tell me the story of how then themselves became development workers, and they resisted practically the cooptation. So cooptation, go back to your question, was not really a total process, didn't really include everybody. Many people didn't really go into that. Or when they went also with a lot of disagreements, and they formed their own version of the conflict resolution field. So yeah, that was practically, and the 90s I think is very important, as you said, because the 90s set the stage for what's happening all the way until today. I think this is important to mention, because the 90s is the time where the US has practically won the war against the Soviet Union, and sets also the foundations for its ideological warfare. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, especially when we talk to fellow, leftists or other people who are interested in social change. And we tend on accusing ourselves, that we lost the war, we are not doing enough. I think we underestimate the ideological warfare that has been waged for 40 years now, without counter practically examples, because for its own reasons, the counter examples like China, for example, or others have chosen to retreat from the ideological warfare, whereas the Soviet Union, for example, was much more active in supporting or participating in the global ideological warfare. Today we don't have practically, I think, formidable counter voices. So I think this is also part of the problem. We cannot really understand what's happening if we don't give attention to the sustained structures of ideological warfare that depoliticize, defund or defunk even political movements around the world. So yeah, I think that would be, I think, how I would answer your question about the activists and the current forms of how did we reach that point, how to unfold. But I think it's by understanding actually and analyzing the ideological warfare and its structures.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Yeah.
To this point, because it's primarily ideological. Because if you adopt the ideological framework, that NGOs operate with, they are very efficient.
Yeah.
But they are very within
in reproducing
that
themselves.
framework,
Yeah.
They are very efficient. There's no waste of any resources.
Yeah, but I do believe again that it is also a symptom of depoliticization, to a great extent, because many people don't have the ability also to think politically, And again, I can use the example of AUB, where I teach, our students. When it comes to thinking about the future, they never really think the future collectively. And it's important, to think of the future collectively as part of a collective that can change things. So there's a lot of individualism, and when you think individually, of course, the NGO is a solution, because you can find a position there, a career possibility. But the fact that the collective thinking about our future is not an option, is not really suggested, is very much, I say, a product of ideological warfare, and not necessarily how society has, I don't believe that society itself is ready to practically commit suicide, because this is what it's been suggested. I mean, if we don't think collectively, it's like practically going into oblivion, socially altogether. Yeah. So, and the class analysis, what you just said, also before, I think is also part of that, because now we see how, for example, we witnessed the return of political economy, for example, like ideas and approaches that they were, somehow pushed out from the official reading of the civil war in the past, but also what's happening in the region today. So we do have an ideological war happening at the level of the academic production. There is a lot of that too. And again, what's happening in Palestine, I think, has pushed for new readings and new approaches that are not really necessarily new. I mean, for example, that we talk more about colonialism. Now we talk more about class politics. We talk about organization. We talk about labor. I think we also, have to see that this is very much connected to what's happening in Palestine. The fact that Mamdani, for example, won in New York, I think it's not disconnected, cannot be disconnected with what's happening in Palestine and how Palestine introduced new vocabularies, new frames, and that they were adopted around the world, and of course here too, but not only here. So, yeah. So I think Palestine is definitely an ally in the ideological warfare, a very strong ally. I think it's our best ally so far.
I
Yeah.
just want to ask, what do you think it looks like to think collectively in like liberal capitalism?
Oh, wow. We need to write a new book about that.
Not in a nutshell, actually, just very practically, because let's say someone has a lot of resources and creates something and makes jobs in Lebanon. Isn't that thinking collectively? Or someone or like Nation Station in Lebanon, the NGO in Jaitewa that makes meals and sends them around. Isn't that thinking collectively? People in the villages that redistribute their clothes, isn't that thinking collectively?
Yeah.
Like, what does
For
it
sure.
look like? And also because I don't actually think that 20 people sitting in AUB thinking collectively is thinking collectively. I think
You're right, yeah.
Yeah, it's
For sure.
I've been in so many AUB rooms and I've never felt like one thing. So yeah, really, what does it mean? Because we talk so abstractly, and one of the things that Palestine has created for some people around me and myself is the complete alienation from theory and from these words that we keep using, and sometimes I think a bit mindlessly, because what are we saying?
Yeah.
What are we actually doing? And there's bombs dropping, and there's people in schools in Ba'abda coming from Dahye, and they don't have food. Like, collectively thinking is bringing maybe a bag of rice or something. And so, and people do that. People do that in Lebanon still, thank God, because otherwise, like, we would have nothing.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think, like, if someone is thinking about getting a job, that's maybe just like thinking collectively is thinking who can give that person a job. I don't know. I'm really genuinely asking because I feel so tired of being in this state of mind of like some like these words being repeated again and again so many times in conversations in New York, and just I don't know, like, what does it mean actually? What does it look like? Like, how?
Join the Lebanese Communist Party.
Okay, sure, yani, why not? But what do you do actually?
Yeah, there's a collective frame, for example. You can also, you don't have to theorize too much about it, but what Palestine has reintroduced is that, there is a collective way of looking at the world, first of all, that we all share similar concerns, of course, not in the same position, not from the same standpoint. So not everybody is in the same positionality, but one of the issues, for example, that can be collectively introduced in Lebanon is that, during the crisis, for example, in 2019, there was a lot of discussion about how Lebanon is very peculiar, very unique, and all discussion about sectarianism and how, what you all suggested makes this idea that Lebanon is not really comparable to anything else around the world. But in fact, if you look at the history, for example, of economic crisis, also my own country, Greece, has also faced a similar conditions. So even the exercise of putting, Lebanon and Greece and other places in the world, in the global south and in the periphery of the global north, like Greece, in a collective analysis where they come together, then it allows you to see that the system that we're living under is practically a system that affects us all. So collectively we have to analyze it, and collectively we have actually to try to change it. That would be a way to act collectively. Of course, I don't mean that people in Lebanon don't act collectively, and I think this is one of the reasons why I choose to live there, because it's definitely one of the most collective places, and definitely generous and extremely also dignified, for sure.
I'm not very convinced, because thinking collectively can go in a different direction, and it could actually be also anti-political, because again, when you think about a country like Lebanon, in which factions have radically different ideas about what the country should be and what future it should have, thinking collectively would require to bring together people with opposing views on how to take the country. Just an example, what Palestine did to Lebanon this time round is it has convinced a faction of the Lebanese, and not an insignificant one, that the only way to achieve peace in Lebanon is normalization with Israel. It goes in the opposite direction of what you're talking about in terms of certain factions, leftist, progressive, etc. There's a big faction of Lebanese people, and I'm not talking about only right-wing fascist factions. Some liberal, middle of the way Lebanese people believe that the way out of all Lebanon's troubles is normalization with Israel. The economy would flourish, and you had peace at the border. The South would come back to extravagance, so on and so forth. From our perspective, they are completely mistaken, but from their own perspective, they are not. Another example is that, and this I have heard that from many Lebanese, is that they look to Turkey with hope that maybe we need somebody like Erdogan in Lebanon. So the solution to Lebanon's problems is fascism. Fascism not in the the Nazi sense, but fascism in the sense of the developmentalist state that Erdogan represents today. Justice and development, the Muslim Brotherhood kind of, or in the classical sense of the developmentalist state, a strong state that basically just rules with an iron fist. So when you talk about collective thinking, you have to admit these ideas into a kind of a national dialogue that is collective, but not necessarily homogeneous or not necessarily even harmonious.
Yeah, of course.
How do you square these different views with each other?
Yeah.
No, definitely.
Not to mention also, questions about Syrian refugees or Palestinian camps or.
No, you're right. I mean, collective here doesn't mean. I definitely don't mean in a liberal democratic, way where everybody comes with their own ideas and we try to find a compromise. I mean, this has been done in Lebanon many times again and again, and I don't think it's how things work. Obviously, and definitely not also in the West, where you have formidable right wing, also fascists, taking the parliaments. So my sense, my version of collective doesn't necessarily mean giving voices to those who practically act against the collective, because to a great extent what you're describing are people who think of Lebanon or of their own country in very narrow sense, I mean, and of course that doesn't necessarily mean collective, it means that we want to represent our own ideas and our own to impose practically our own ideas on others, and this is what's been happening also in Lebanon all these years. My sense of collective is mainly understood as, that most of the people practically that bear the consequences of the current system don't have a voice, and they have been deprived of their voice. Even in the West, the fascist politics are practically amplified, extremely amplified by these structures that we describe here, and made possible by ideological warfare in the guise of media, for example. The media play a very important role in amplifying certain voices. Institutions also like the army, like church, in the West, or political parties are also amplifiers of a certain voice that wants to represent the collective. And I think this is also part of the ideological warfare. So when I say collective, I don't mean let's accept, everybody's voice as a given, because this also collective is a product of the ideological warfare. Practically, I say, we have to fight, first of all, the ideological war, and then create a new collective that very much includes those who nowadays don't have a voice, that don't have actually a presence in the public sphere, but also in the way that politics is organized. So yes, not the liberal collective I'm talking about. It's practically a different kind of collective that mobilizes and brings to the fore people who otherwise are not really organized. And for that matter, I think we need also to connect not also within the national imaginary, but also internationalist alliances where you can reconnect, to recollectivize. For example, one of the symptoms of the ideological warfare is that you don't have any more the solidarity that you used to have internationally. If you look at the 70s, you had people, for example, Belgrade, coming out in support of Vietnam. You had people in Greece coming out in support of Chile. You had people actually in the Polytechnic, in Greece in 1973 was very much in solidarity with Thailand. So this kind of collective, also the global collective struggles are very important. Also because we are to a great extent part of a very collective predicament, which is called climate change. It affects all of us collectively. I think these are also reasons to think collectively, but also organize collectively. Yeah, this is more of a movement rather than a parliament. If you wish. Yeah.
So before, I think we might be out of time,
Yeah.
right? Close to that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The last question
Oops. Yeah.
is about the amazing cover. I know we're not supposed to judge books, but we always do. So maybe we should give a shout out to Dalia Khamisi, or talk about the photographer behind the book cover and why you chose it.
Yeah, this is a photograph by a friend, Dalia Khamisi. She's a photographer, Palestinian photographer, living in Lebanon, born and raised in Lebanon. The photograph was part of a series of photographs on abandoned houses. It's an abandoned house in Lebanon that was, I think, which part of, I don't remember now which part of the country it is, but it's not Beirut. I think it's outside of Beirut. And what I find fascinating with this cover, there's supposed to be, of course, a bigger picture. This is part of a picture. It's not only that part, it's a cropped. Yeah. And there's a couch here, apparently, and of course an abandoned couch. So it's much more of an interior of a house.
It's looking at the reconstruction.
But
process,
yes,
right?
exactly. So it's very much
dilapidated,
the frame. How through the frame of a destroyed house, practically an abandoned house, the reconstruction is framed. So yeah. So I just thought that this is the best way to talk about, these guys who are somehow in the business of framing peace. How framing of peace is very much at the center of the book. Because it's also easy to find pictures that depict peacemakers. It's not really, they are not really very
inspiring.
Yeah, inspiring. It's not, they're not the most aesthetically pleasing crowd. Yeah,
that's for sure.
That was it.
I think that's a great way to end.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
We can.
Otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the questions. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Okay, thank
Ooh.
you, Kate.
People's Farm again.
Yeah.
Was this on Zoom?
It was on YouTube.
YouTube?
Yeah.
I have questions
Oops.
on the virtual